Hello, everybody. Welcome back to me, your host, Christian Watson. My friends, I have been meditating over this Russia and Ukraine conflict over the past week or so, and even before that, when the precursor events to this conflict, whether it be Russia amassing troops on the borders of Ukraine, and recognizing the sovereignty of Donbass and Donetsk, and doing things that basically signals to the rest of the world that they're going to do the invasion. I've been meditating. And I've been waiting for an opportune moment to speak. And I think at this point in the conflict, which is almost a weekend now, a week into the formal invasion rather, it's time to speak. I've been noticing that a lot of coverage of the conflict, as most coverage of most issues that relate to politics, geopolitics, or whatever, have to do with surface level understanding of the events in question. A lot of people are blindly accepting the idea that Ukraine is good or Ukraine is evil. There are two sides of the coin, right? The people who think that Ukraine is good are people who think the West should support Ukraine. And those who believe that Ukraine is evil believe that Ukraine is covered and ran by Nazis and things of that sort. That Russia is good, Russia is evil. There's all kind of different tribes that have amassed in the current discourse, and they're just fighting back and punching back at each other. And of course, caught up in this sort of discourse is the perception of Vladimir Putin as well. There are some folks that think Vladimir Putin is what they call a monster. There are some folks think that Vladimir Putin is just some weird aberration of the human condition who is doing all this terrible stuff. And I don't disagree with that per se. I think Vladimir Putin certainly is a condemnable and contemptible man. But I think that geopolitics and all kinds of politics, in all honesty, have a way of separating us from the very real principles which influence things on a broader scale. What am I saying? What I'm saying is a lot of people, when they distinguish themselves from Putin and says, oh, Putin is a monster, they put him in this category of criminal, saying he's a war criminal or whatever. We are separating ourselves from the possibility that perhaps there's more to Putin than us slurring him as a monster. Maybe Putin's mentalities here are reflective of something much deeper that go beyond Putin and actually manifest in all of our lives. Hence the topic of today's video, that every single one of us could be Vladimir Putin. And I'm going to give you the tools to make sure that you can never, ever will be like him. Because in all honesty, my friends, most of us will not be like Vladimir Putin proper, right? We won't have massive militaries at our disposal. We won't have massive intelligence agencies that can poison our political opponents for us. But many of us certainly can have the mentalities that create something like Vladimir Putin, and we can enact our own version of tyranny in our own private and local lives, which may be much more dangerous than doing so on a geopolitical scale. Because, whereas what's happening in Russia right now is affecting people who are close to Russia, what's happening in Russia is not per se having an immediate impact on the lives of most Americans. Now, of course, in some ways there are the sanctions and so on and so forth, but it's easy to forget what's happening because we're not proximal to it. And human beings tend to understand and appreciate the proximal as opposed to the distant. But the best way we can demonstrate the link between Vladimir Putin and the potential link between all of us, between him and us, is by examining his arguments as to why he wanted to invade Ukraine. And there is no better place to start than on his February 21st speech, in which Putin essentially lays down an entire history of the USSR. He critiques what he calls the failures of various communist politicians and ensuring that the USSR was bound together by strong political assurances. In fact, one of Putin's arguments is that the breaking away of Ukraine is simply a result of initially Vladimir Lenin's attempt to give USSR countries, the ability to be self-determinant. And then Lenin, Putin continues, did not at all revise Lenin's mistake, and that continued on throughout the ages until like the late 1980s, where the USSR, in an attempt to keep political power, gave more of their states more sovereignty and more rights to self-determination, which eventually led to created the foundation which led to Ukraine eventually becoming an independent nation. And throughout his entire February 21st speech, Putin is angry about this. He's griping about this. In fact, I will give you a few excerpts of this. Let's start with this one.
И вот в сентябре 1989 года на пленуме ЦК КПСС был принят, по сути, роковой документ. Так называемая национальная политика партии в современных условиях. Платформа КПСС. Она содержала следующее положение. Процитирую. Союзным республикам принадлежат все права, отвечающие их статусу суверенных социалистических государств. Еще один пункт. Высшие представительные органы власти союзных республик могут опротестовать и приостановить действия постановлений и распоряжений союзного правительства на своей территории. И, наконец, каждая союзная республика имеет свое гражданство, которое распространяется на всех ее жителей. Разве не очевидно было, к чему приведут подобные формулировки и решения?
Okay, now this one.
И предложил пойти на уступки националистам, как он их тогда называл, независимцам. Именно эти ленинские идеи, по сути, конфедеративного государственного устройства и лозунг о праве нации на самоопределение вплоть до отделения и были положены в основу советской государственности. Сначала в 1922 году закреплены в Декларации об образовании Союза СССР, а затем после смерти Ленина и в Конституции СССР 1924 года. Исторических судеб России и ее народов ленинские принципы государственного строительства оказались не просто ошибкой. Это было, как говорится, гораздо хуже, чем ошибка. После развала СССР в 1991 году это стало абсолютно очевидным.
Okay, these two excerpts show that in the back of Putin's mind is not necessarily NATO or the Nazis, the supposed Nazis in Ukraine, which is two things that he has used as justifications for his special military operation, but rather it is a historical gripe with how those before him have handled matters of national sovereignty and national cohesion. We're about to get to something deeper here, my friends. Now, it also helps us to understand, since Putin thinks that Ukraine's independence was created from faulty ground laid down by his predecessors, how does Putin actually view Ukraine? Well, right here he is telling us how he views the nation of Ukraine.
Не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства. Это наши товарищи, близкие, среди которых не только коллеги, друзья, бывшие сослуживцы, но и родственники. Люди, связанные с нами кровными семейными узами.
As you heard, Ukraine is not merely a country that has a political history with Russia. Ukraine is a country that shares a cultural and spiritual affinity with Russia, according to what Putin says. So, my friends, Putin's argument, the core of it, is that political matters may have changed, but they should not have changed because the USSR's condition was the proper one for Russia's territories. And since Ukraine was made by Russia per se and used to be a part of the Russian sphere, and since that principle says that Ukraine has this sort of spiritual connection with Russia, Ukraine must stay in Russia, and therefore Putin, in his mind, is simply taking what belongs to him and what his predecessors couldn't keep because of their geopolitical miscalculations. This is not about NATO. This is not about Nazis. This is not about Ukraine not upholding its treaties. This is about Putin linking the country of Ukraine to a metaphysical idea of it being one with Russia. Well, there are many problems with this, my friends. Countries are not spiritual beings, nor do countries have spiritual connections. A country is merely a collection of people under a particular geographic political entity and within a certain confined set of borders. These things are not inherently linked to any spiritual anything. But what Putin is doing is he's creating this idea of Ukraine in his head, the idea of Ukraine that was created after it was quote-unquote crafted by Lenin, and he is operating with this idea of Ukraine in his head, and he is using this idea of Ukraine to address the current Ukraine. So in other words, Putin is essentially butchering the reality of what's happened. He is butchering the fact that many Ukrainians do not want to be in his country, and many Ukrainians want to remain sovereign and independent by interpreting them and interpreting their political actions through what happened 60, 70, 80 plus years ago. Because that's where he's stuck at. So this leads us into his argument from tradition. The idea that Ukraine was made by Lenin, as he said, right here,
Основанием назвать Украина имени Владимира Ильича Ленина. Он ее автор и архитектор.
And therefore, since Ukraine was made by Lenin, it must always be Lenin. Well, that's not how it works. Countries are essentially the extensions of the people's in them will. A country that is founded on just principles will always conform to the consent of the governed. If a country does not conform to the consent of the governed, then it conforms to the consent of the governors. This is what happens in an autocracy. When you have someone like Putin, who has basically arbitrarily seized all power within Russia and can essentially dismiss the Duma at will, he can cause military operations at will, he can poison his opponents, he has essentially the consent of himself and the consent of those who are close to him, right? He doesn't have to worry about the people. But again, this is illegitimate because you still have consent coming from one person. Any form of government has to have consent from a person. If it's the governed, it's a more legitimate government. If it's one or two people, it's a less legitimate government or not legitimate at all. Here's the point. The point is, a country is not, a country's being, condition, is not created due to one person crafting its borders. A country's being and condition is built or should be built upon universal principles and then continued by its populace throughout the ages. And that's how you can estimate what a country is. Now, Putin criticizes Ukraine for not being a proper state since it broke away from the USSR, but yet Putin does not define statehood at all in his argument. In fact, Putin says that this is not a time, his speech, to talk about statehood. That's another flaw in his arguments. So, the idea that the USSR gave its member states too much freedom and liberty to determine the destiny of their own countries is what Putin is getting at here. And there's a philosophy behind this, my friends. Putin's objections to the existence of Ukraine and Putin's emphasis on what happened in the past in Russia and his emphasis on Lenin's political project and on Stalin's political project clearly demonstrates that Putin's mind is tainted by what has been, not what is, and he is fixed on this abstract idea of Russia that does not actually exist in reality. He is fixed on this abstract idea of Russia that was crafted by his forefathers, and he sees himself standing in the tradition of the people who came before him. But my friends, this confuses the local with the eternal. As I mentioned a few moments ago, countries, governments are founded upon, or at least just governments rather, are founded upon universal principles. If they are not, then they will result to chaos and destruction. This is one of the reasons why a lot of countries have had their governments dissolve and reform over many years. And America, interestingly enough, has only had one time like this in its history where its government maintained its hold and power, the Civil War. But many other countries around the world, if you look at any of their history, have had conflicts that have dissolved and reformed the governments because the idea of first principles wasn't as stable, whereas in America, there are most certainly first principles of individual freedom, liberty, natural law, which the country is built upon and which provide a moral calculus for every single thing the government does. That's the eternal. And those first principles are not tainted by what an American politician might say he wants to happen to the country, because again, that's the local. Putin confuses the local, what happened in the USSR, with the eternal, someone's ability or a country's ability to determine their own self-governance. And when he confuses the two, he's not able to see clearly, and he is not making a coherent argument. Again, good government is based off of eternal moral principles, which flow from logic, not mere tradition. The problem with Putin is that his ideas flow from mere tradition without actually investigating if that tradition be justified whatsoever. So Putin has not even checked his premises. Putin is assuming that Lenin's political project was flawed because Lenin didn't consider that self-governance could lead to the dissolution of the USSR, but he's not actually trying to look at the premises of Lenin's project. He's simply looking at one defect of it. If you guys don't see how you could be just like this in a second, it'll become clearer to you. Here's the deal. Putin's mind is bound and tainted by the past, and he is not able or willing to see beyond tradition. And yet many of us in our own lives have this same affliction. Many of us define our lives in the terms that our mother, father, grandfather, grandmother, great-grandmother, cousins, aunts have all done for us throughout the history of our family. I'm sure you've heard many people say, well, my family does this, therefore I do this. Oh, this has been tradition in my family, therefore I do this. Well, I wasn't raised that way. All of these phrases are ultimately appeals to a tradition that we exist in. And I'm not suggesting that all traditions are bad. But what I am suggesting is that when we uphold our upbringing and our past as sacrosanct and unassailable to criticism is the moment we blind ourselves to potential moral injustice. If you simply look at a claim on the basis of who supported it and not on the basis of its merits, you could be blinding yourselves to serious flaws of the claim. If your family said you're a woman and you should not wear jeans because you're a woman, and you just accept that premise throughout your entire life, you are literally binding yourself to an old position that may at all have no justification, that actually has no justification whatsoever under any kind of logic, and was simply put there because their mother and grandfather said it, and then it kept going back throughout family history, the sort of sartorial choices of people in the family. Of course, this is a more extreme example, but the point is this. The same way Putin is touting Lenin and arguing with the dead bodies of Russian ancestors who apparently didn't do right by the USSR, and trying to fix their mistakes in a present in which the USSR no longer exists and the geopolitical reality is very different, is the same way we can bind our own selves in our own lives to things that are long past, dead in the past, but live inside of our minds. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that we are not supposed to be accounted for by old traditions and dead societies because they do not necessarily speak to what is happening right now. Now, I would add an addendum to that. We are not to be accounted for old traditions and dead societies, especially if those societies are not based upon eternal principles. When you have eternal principles, then you can more easily apply them to any temporal situation. But when these principles are built entirely upon a temporary geopolitical situation, like Putin's understanding of the USSR and his supposed right over Ukraine is, then once again, you are not going to be able to go beyond that very narrow window of thinking. Every single one of us can be just like Putin. Even if we don't have the armies, the intelligence services, or the platform that speaks to billions around the world. We can be just like Putin. If we don't learn to let go of the past, if we don't learn to check our premises and see if what we have been taught as we've grown up is worth using anymore in our present and our future, and if we confuse the local with the eternal and never grasp universal principles for what they are, and that is an eternal wellspring, an eternal elixir from which we can drink that'll provide us intellectual nourishment, that'll guide us throughout our lives and our moral decision making. So my question is this: will you hold on to your past and uncritically accept the premises of your past? Or will you confront your past, evaluate your past in a way that does not affirm it, but in a way that looks at it for what it is, and then take bits and pieces of what is relevant to you now into your future and leave it there. Leave other pieces there because they're no longer irrelevant to you or where you're going in life. I hope you will do the latter, because if you don't, you just might unlock a form of personal tyranny that could wreak havoc upon folks in your life and wreak havoc upon your ability to grow as a human being. Think on it, guys. I love you guys so much. If you love me, please support me on Patreon. Please join the Discord. Please send me an email. I love emails. I love hearing from you guys. Please comment, like, subscribe, and share. But most importantly, my friends, please stay pensive. Bye, guys. Love you.